Hi, everyone. I'm Vassy Kapelos. This is the Power and Politics podcast for Wednesday, February 3rd. On the pod today, more vaccine is on the way, but the doses are from COVAX, a program designed to help, in part, low and middle income countries get immunized. We're going to ask the development minister why Canada is the only G7 country to access COVAX vaccines in this first round. Plus, Canada officially names the Proud Boys and 12 other groups as terrorist organizations. Did the Capitol Hill insurrection factor into that decision, and to what degree? The public safety minister will join us later on, and I'll ask him. First, though, let's catch you up on the details of COVAX. COVAX is a program run in part by the World Health Organization. The idea is for wealthy countries to buy vaccines for their own citizens, but also to help fund immunization programs in low and middle income countries. Today, COVAX announced its initial allocation of AstraZeneca doses. By contributing more than $400 million to the program, Canada is entitled to get doses, but as it stands, this country is the only one in the G7 accessing those doses in this first round. Is that at the expense of developing countries? Karina Gould is the Minister of International Development. She's with us from Burlington. Hi, Minister. Good to see you. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you, Vassy.
Minister, your government and ministers within your colleagues, your ministerial colleagues, have often insisted that Canada has the most diverse portfolio of vaccines in the world. So why is this country taking vaccines right now from COVAX?
Well, COVAX is actually part of that portfolio. COVAX has two streams. It has a self-financing stream for countries like Canada to purchase vaccines through, and then it has the AMC stream, the advanced market commitment for donations to be made to countries who can't purchase vaccines. So that was actually part of the portfolio from the beginning.
But it's already so diverse, and it's not like other G7 countries are accessing this first round, right? You didn't have to access vaccines in this first round, yet Canada decided to. Why?
Well, I mean, as you know, our top priority is to ensure that Canadians have access to vaccines. And so joining COVAX, being part of that, was part of it all along. As I said, from the summer, COVAX, we joined as a self-financing country. COVAX's objective is to provide vaccines for 20% of the populations of all member states, both self-financing and those who will receive donations. And so, Canada made the decision, as other countries have, to take on this first allocation because we recognize how important it is to ensure Canadians have access to vaccines. And this is one of the pieces of the portfolio that Minister Anand and the Government of Canada have entered into.
Respectfully, though, other countries in the G7 have not made that similar decision that Canada did. What does that say?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of other countries. All I can speak on is behalf of the Government of Canada, which, is aiming to get vaccines to Canadians. We have Pfizer vaccines, Moderna. This is another kind of vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, that doesn't require the same ultra cold chain storage, and so can be administered in different settings. So it just adds to the portfolio that we have here in Canada. We are also, of the G7 countries, we're actually the second largest contributor to the COVAX AMC. So our position has always been that, we need to get vaccines for Canadians, but we also need to get them for the world. And so we're actually one of the leading contributors to the COVAX AMC. I'm the co-chair of the AMC engagement group. And so making sure and really believing in this mechanism and trusting it and having the confidence is an important thing for Canada.
There is a separate agreement as well, though, with AstraZeneca, Minister, that is expected to, if the vaccine is approved, this country would receive 20 million doses of. I want to read for you a quote in the Globe and Mail from Jason Nickerson, a humanitarian affairs advisor at Doctors Without Borders, who says, if you're using COVAX doses, which could otherwise be used to vaccinate high-risk people in low-income countries, to vaccinate low-risk people in Canada, I don't think that's a defensible position. There are human rights groups who are criticizing Canada for accessing these doses right now when they could be going to lower and middle income countries.
So as I said from the beginning, the COVAX facility was designed with two pillars. One, for countries who have the ability to purchase vaccines to do that. And the self-financing portion is actually important for the AMC because it enables COVAX to purchase doses on behalf of developing countries as well. So it's part of the funding that goes towards the sustainability and the ability to procure through COVAX. And it was always intended to be a mechanism to provide equitable access and to really try to distribute vaccines both in the developed world and the developing world at roughly the same time. So it's important to note that COVAX made its allocation decisions based on those that were member countries. And, that's something that Canada has been part of from the very beginning. And, that's also something that we helped set the COVAX facility up in the first place and are very strong contributors, both in terms of being a self-financing country, showing our confidence in the mechanism, recognizing that it's working right now. I think today's announcement was a really good one, demonstrating that they have access to vaccines and that those allocations are going to start rolling out in the coming weeks right around the world.
If our portfolio, though, and our vaccine procurement was so strong, couldn't we have waited until a later time to access the vaccines through COVAX, thereby enabling lower income countries to benefit from this arrangement first?
That's one way of looking at it, but the other way is also that, we may not take the next allocation depending on what the situation in Canada looks like.
Is this an admission then that the situation here is not good, that procurement has not been working out?
No. What I'm saying is that, this was part of the strategy from the get-go, right? We always knew that at the beginning there was going to be a situation of scarcity because you have to ramp up manufacturing. There are only a couple of vaccines, and actually it's quite a modern miracle that we even have vaccines such a short period of time after discovering this. And now that we have this mechanism in place that's really working to address vaccine access and equity around the world is a huge success. And Canada is a big supporter of this and want to see it be successful.
But again, wouldn't we be a bigger supporter if we put off our access to those vaccines, allowed lower income countries, which right now are being vaccinated at a lower rate than this country, even though we're low compared to other countries? Doesn't it say something about the government's procurement efforts thus far?
No, because COVAX was always part of the strategy from the very beginning, recognizing, as I said, that if you think back to the summer, we didn't actually know which, if any, vaccines were going to be successful. The fact that two of the vaccines that we entered into an agreement with, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, were both successful, have already started to arrive in the country, I think is a huge indication of the incredible work that went through, the vaccine task force and advisory group, the fact that the government entered into agreements with those vaccines, as well as the fact that, we needed to spread our risk, and joining the COVAX facility was a good way to do that. And that's something that countries around the world have done, recognizing that we just didn't know which vaccines were going to be successful. And now the fact that you have Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, we have promising results for Novavax and Johnson & Johnson, both of whom are, in the COVAX facility, as well as with we have agreements with. That's really good. We now need to ramp up manufacturing so that we can get more doses here in Canada and around the world.
But the way in which your government, put forth the idea of COVAX wasn't necessarily as this is going to save our own domestic supply. This is what we're going to have to rely on in the early months of 2021 for our own supply. It was to help developing countries. You talked to Canadians and told them that you were leaders on that front in helping developing countries, because unless people in those countries are vaccinated, the virus cannot be tamed, right? It can't. This pandemic will not be over. And in fact, in this occurrence, you are taking some of those vaccines, which I understand is part of the arrangement, but those vaccines, as a consequence, will not go to those lower and middle income countries right now.
In fairness, Vassy, right from the beginning, we always talked about the two pillars of COVAX, the fact that Canada was joining as a self-financing country. And in fact, we did that. We were one of the first to do that. and that we were contributing an equal share. So the $220 million it cost to join as a self-financing country, we also contributed to the advanced market contribution, which makes us the second highest contributor in the world to the COVAX facility. So we are, in fact, leading on both of those items. And it was always presented as a way to mitigate some of the risk in terms of what different vaccine outcomes could look like. So absolutely, we are part of COVAX to support developing countries. It's part of the really important work that we're doing as Canada, but also through our multilateral efforts. But it was also always intended to be part of Canada's domestic strategy.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. Appreciate your time.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
That's Karina Gold. She's the Minister of International Development. So what exactly is COVAX and how does it work? Here's a quick explainer. COVAX was launched last April during the onset of the pandemic. It's a global alliance of wealthier countries that buy vaccines for themselves, but also for poor and middle-income nations. At least 145 countries have signed on. Canada contributed $440 million to the fund. Half of that amount secures doses for this country, up to 15 million of them. The other half will buy doses for the 92 countries which can't afford it. COVAX intends to distribute 2 billion doses in total this year. News from the Ontario government. New details on when schools in the province's hot zones can reopen.
And with the introduction of tough measures and the stay-at-home orders for all Ontarians, we have seen a consistent decline in community transmission. With the full support of the Chief Medical Officer of Health and with the unanimous support of all local medical officers of health, Ontario is ready to reopen our schools because it is safe.
For more, let's bring in the CBC's Laura McQuillan in Toronto. Hi, Laura. What do Ontario parents watching right now need to know about this announcement?
Okay, Vassy. So what we learned from the Minister is that 13 school boards are going to be going back, or rather areas are going to be going back from Monday. Those include some hotspot areas, Windsor, Essex and Hamilton. That's just a few days from now, 5 days, so not a lot of time to prepare for those areas. The three hottest of the hotspots, Toronto, Peel and York, will go back on February 16th after Family Day. And one key detail that the Ontario government also said about this is that emergency childcare will wind down once each of those areas has gone back to school. What we heard in that clip, especially from the Minister, Stephen Lecce, is there was unanimous support for getting students back to school on these dates from the local medical officers of health. So 1.5 million students we're talking about here. But we did also hear from Ontario's top doctor, Dr. David Williams, that they had actually hoped to get everyone back next Monday. But once they had that consultation, they realised it wouldn't be feasible if they were to get students back into school, keep those schools open right through to June. So that's the plan for now. You heard Mr. Lecce speaking about those measures. They've been announced previously, including getting up to 50,000 asymptomatic tests done each week. What we do know is that's going to be left to the public health units to decide which schools need them, when. We're talking about 2 million students as well as staff. So that number is going to be a bit of a drop in the ocean, and we don't know when that will fully roll out. But there does seem to be a degree of confidence from the province that it can get students back safely, and that is the promise that they're making today.
Is there anything that can thwart that plan? And in particular, I'm thinking about the threat that variants of the virus pose.
Yeah, and there were some questions on that front. We heard from Dr. Williams, you look at the UK, they're already closing schools because they have found the variants getting into schools so much more transmissible. He said that he's pretty confident that with the testing, with the other measures that they are rolling out for this new school year, that they will be able to keep those in check. The message from him and Stephen Lecce that they won't shy away from shutting schools down again if they feel the need to. But it will be left up to local medical officers of health to make that call in the first place, whether a cohort needs to be sent home, whether a school should be shut down while that testing takes place, while they make sure everyone is safe to go back to school. The message from Stephen Lecce, they will listen to expert advice on this, but already we are hearing from some parents some worries that even before, schools reopen, there could be some changes to this timetable, and they say they will not stop holding their breath until their kids get back in those schoolroom doors.
Okay. Thank you very much, Laura, for that update. Really appreciate it. The CBC's Laura McQuillan for us. Health Canada is soon expected to make a decision on approving a third COVID vaccine, the Oxford AstraZeneca shot. The federal government has secured 20 million doses. New research out today suggests the vaccine doesn't just limit severity of viral symptoms, but also limits the transmission of the virus itself. At the same time, the vaccine is also facing criticism over the lack of data collected for older adults. Earlier, I spoke with Professor Adrian Hill, the director of the Jenner Institute at Oxford University. He's also one of the researchers involved in discovering this vaccine. I asked him what exactly the new data says about transmission.
There are three things you might like a vaccine to do: stop severe disease and death. All of the licensed vaccines do that really well, over 95% efficacy, including ours. Then the second measure that's most commonly reported is what does it do against mild or moderate COVID, symptomatic episodes that don't end you up in hospital. And there the numbers vary from 60% to 95%. But what you very seldom see reported is efficacy against transmission, because there you have to swab the nose and throat of thousands of volunteers. We had about 12,000 in our trial in the UK every week for months and months and months, have those swabs sent in and analyze them. And you get a measure of whether the vaccine is stopping people being infectious as opposed to unwell, infectious to other people, at a time when they're asymptomatic. And we do now have a read on that, and the overall efficacy of our vaccine against transmission or being infectious, as determined by a PCR test, is about 67%. So it's great to have that read on at least one vaccine, showing that COVID vaccines can prevent people being infectious.
And that's pretty significant. I mean, I remember listening to public health officials in this country often talk about how that evidence was so far missing. They're waiting to see, because that would be one of the key determinants in when restrictions can be lifted and things along that line. How significant is it from your perspective to see that result?
We think it's really important. As you say, it's something the public health officials have been waiting for. It's also particularly important if you're vaccinating younger people who tend not to get so unwell or unwell at all, but can often be infectious and transmitting to their families and people they meet without knowing it. So I think this really enhances the case for vaccinating all over 18-year-olds to prevent transmission predominantly in the younger population and, of course, disease and death in older adults.
Let me ask you a follow-up about older adults, because I know our viewers have expressed some confusion about some of the information they're getting where this vaccine is concerned and people over 65. Swiss authorities, for example, withheld their approval today of this vaccine, citing lack of data in trials in older people. France said that it won't use the vaccine for people over the age of 65. Can you explain for us? I know that there's I guess the concern is around a lack of data in that age group. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the background here is that many vaccines are not tested in every subgroup of the population that you would like to see efficacy in every ethnic group and every age group. And they tend to be licensed then on good efficacy in a major group, say 0 to 7 or 18 to 70-year-olds in this case, where if you get good efficacy in that group and an immune response that you can demonstrate is induced equivalently or to a higher level in the other population group, then you issue a license for all of the populations. And that's why the European Medicines Agency, which has, 27 member states, all of whom voted unanimously to approve this vaccine for all individuals over 18 years of age. The same happened in the UK, of course, as well. But that's relying on immunogenicity. We also have data coming, the numbers are fairly small, on efficacy in older adults over 65 years of age. At the moment, there are only 10 of those cases that were reported until early December, when we had our last data lock. 8 of them were in the control group and 2 in the vaccination group. So that's clearly trending in the right direction. There are more data already. We're now nearly 2 months later. There will be a lot of data from a US trial that has fully recruited about 35,000 people. And there are data from passive surveillance of millions of people in the UK, mainly older adults, who have been vaccinated with the same AstraZeneca vaccine. So more data are coming in very quickly. I think the age issue will be remedied very soon in the small number of countries that have not given a full age range licensure.
We're still waiting, final question for you, Professor, in this country to see what the approval, the approval comes and what it looks like. Do you have any expectation on a timeline? We were told at some point late last week it could be coming in the coming days.
That's exactly what we were told, so we will wait and see. But yes, it could be soon.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor. Appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you very much.
That's Professor Adrian Hill, one of the researchers behind the AstraZeneca vaccine. The federal government officially listed the Proud Boys a terrorist entity today. The neo-fascist group was founded by a Canadian in 2016. Its members allegedly played a key role in the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. The government also named 3 other violent extremist groups with ties to neo-Nazis to the list. Bill Blair is the Minister of Public Safety. He joins us from Toronto. Hi, Minister Blair. Good to see you again. Thanks for making the time.
Of course.
Minister, would the Proud Boys be on this list without the attack on Capitol Hill happening?
Yeah, I believe they would. But let me be really clear. I know that many Canadians and politicians suddenly became aware on January 6th about the risk that this organization represented. But the work of our national security intelligence agencies and law enforcement and our international partners, particularly in the United States, on not just the Proud Boys, but all the groups we've listed today, began years ago. And we've been monitoring their activities, gathering intelligence and the evidence necessary to make this determination that we've announced today. I will acknowledge, of course, that on January 6th, and not just on January 6th, but in the weeks and months leading up to that event throughout the entire U.S. election, there was an escalation. And I think that's the best way to describe it. There was a significant escalation towards violence of a number of different organizations, including the Proud Boys as listed today. And certainly the events on January 6th also provided our intelligence agencies and our law enforcement agencies with a trove of new evidence upon which they could, first of all, provide me with advice. And based on that advice and a very careful examination of all of the evidence and intelligence gathered over the past several years, I came to a determination that it meets the threshold of forming reasonable and probable grounds to believe that organization and others should be listed as terrorist entities. I also had that evidence evaluated by the Department of Justice and received a very positive advice of support for that determination. It's a legal process, Vassy, and not a political one. And I understand the political context of these discussions, but the decision has to be based on law and it has to be based on evidence. And I want to assure Canadians we've done that work. It's also really important because the determination of an organization or individual as a terrorist entity has significant legal implications. And it has to be defensible in law and based on the evidence. And we've done that work.
Yeah, and I certainly have questions about both the politics and the legalities associated with it. But just on the question, when you talk about, for example, an escalation of threats of violence or an escalation of violence, even without that, so I just want to be crystal clear, even without what's happened since the U.S. election and on January 6th, you think you would have arrived at this designation regardless?
Well, I can tell you the work has been ongoing. Even in 2017, that particular organization had involvement at a demonstration in Charlottesville, where there was deeply concerning activities, not just in rhetoric, but in violence. We saw that again in other large-scale demonstrations in Portland, Oregon, in Seattle, and Washington. We also saw, as events transcribed leading up to the January 6th insurrection, that there were a number of different activities that drew the attention of law enforcement and the careful attention of our national security intelligence agencies, who've been gathering evidence on this escalating threat for some considerable period of time. I will tell you that the evidence that we were evaluating strongly indicated that movement towards violence, they have long been a group known for its hateful rhetoric and their intolerance. And some of their activities, but we've seen an escalation in violence, in the use and acquisition of weapons, in the advocacy of violence against individuals and politicians and others across the continent, which was deeply concerning. And certainly in the totality, that evidence brought us to the preponderance of evidence is more than sufficient to form the reasonable probable grounds.
Right. If that evidence, though, did exist in some form, prior to what's happened, why didn't you make this designation earlier? Does that not open you up to criticisms or characterizations that this is politically motivated?
Well, I think some of the political rhetoric that's been attached to this, and even political fundraising that some have engaged in, I think is unfortunate in that it undermines public confidence in the process. It's one of the reasons I've tried very hard today to explain how important that legal process and evidence gathering is. It is the work of, and I will tell you, Canadians should have great confidence in our national security intelligence agencies, both CSIS and CSE, as well as our law enforcement agencies, including, of course, the RCMP, in gathering intelligence and the evidence required to meet this legal threshold, and also the important advice and work of our Department of Justice. Our officials have been at the forefront of this work. They're not motivated by politics. They're motivated entirely by public safety. They've been doing that work on our behalf. They remain constantly vigilant. I have great confidence in the work that they're doing. I've seen the fruits of their labors. I've had the opportunity to evaluate the evidence and intelligence and in discussions with the Department of Justice to be confident that their work meets that legal threshold for this determination. It's not based on whatever a politician may say in the House of Commons or at a news conference. It has to be based on evidence and the rule of law.
Respectfully, though, Minister, at the beginning of this interview, I asked you, without what happened on January 6th, would you have arrived at this conclusion and made this designation? And you said you would have. So the question still remains, why not make it earlier than now?
Well, and clearly that work has been ongoing for some considerable period of time. But as I hope I also made clear to you, Vassy, the events leading up to January 6th, even before the U.S. election, and then events leading up to January 6th, what our law enforcement and our international partners witnessed very clearly was an escalation towards violence. An escalation not just in the rhetoric, but in actual acts in furtherance of that rhetoric to engage in acts of violence and make very real threats and take steps to carry out those threats against individuals and institutions, particularly in the United States. But those threats also represent a significant threat to Canadians here and abroad. And so that evidence that was being gathered over those several months contributed very significantly to this determination.
But you still would have made it without it, you said.
No, what I said was that we've been gathering that evidence and the activities were deeply concerning. I also want to be very clear that over a number of months leading to January 6th, there was a continuing escalation of violence. And certainly on January 6th, the activities of the Proud Boys and many others in Washington on that day have provided national security intelligence agencies and law enforcement with a trove of new evidence upon which we can make the determination of these groups as a terrorist entity, and that's what we have done today. I'm not dismissing the importance of the evidence that was available to us as a result of the weeks and months leading up to and occurring on January 6th, but I also want to advise you, Vassy, that this has been on the radar of our security and our law enforcement agencies for a number of different years, increasingly concerning. And now we have the evidence to meet that threshold. Let me also say that there are a number of other significant groups that are also engaged in odious, hateful rhetoric and odious, hateful activities, which are deeply concerning to us. We continue to gather that evidence. The process of listing terrorist entities is an evergreen process. It's not an annual event. And so as that evidence and as those thresholds are met, I am quite prepared to bring forward additional measures of listing additional entities, but it has to be based not on the latest political rhetoric and what's on TV that night. It has to be based on the evidence. It has to be based on the law. And I've got a responsibility to make sure that the evidence and the law are what drive this process and not some other, popular consideration.
You've made a number of references to other politicians who have political considerations here. Which politicians are you referring to?
Yeah, well, you know what? I think what's important here is that we are taking the steps that are necessary and are useful in keeping Canadians safe. That's what I'm focused on. And I just want to be really clear because I think it's important. We have to be able to defend these decisions in a court of law. And it's absolutely critical that the decisions we make with respect to the listing of these entities not be based on some political calculation, but rather on the evidence and the law. And I want to assure Canadians that that's exactly how this decision was made, and it was not in any way influenced by anyone's political
Yes,
rhetoric.
you've made that point, Minister, but in 3 different occasions in this interview, you've also characterized other politicians as being political, right? They just suddenly became aware is something that you said. Who are you referring to?
Well, and again, I don't think it's useful, frankly, in the context of this determination of listing this as an entity. Let me also acknowledge, I understand the political context is this. I understand that Canadians are quite rightfully concerned and became perhaps more significantly aware of the activities of these entities over the past several months, not just on January 6th. And it's quite understandable that politicians would reflect the concern of their constituents and Canadians. And I have that concern too. I also have constituents that I represent, but I want to also be able to assure Canadians that we follow very carefully the legal process that is appropriate and necessary to make sure that the determination of any organization or any individual as a terrorist entity is based on the principles of law and solid foundation of evidence and intelligence.
Yeah, you certainly made that point. I just want to be clear. Jagmeet Singh is the one who introduced this motion in the House of Commons. I know that you said even at the time it would be based on, legal considerations and all the things that you've just laid out. But are you saying that he's reflecting his constituents, or are you saying that he's being too political about this?
No. Listen, Jagmeet Singh's a politician. So am I. But what I'm trying very hard to do is clearly defend the legal process, which is founded entirely on the law and on evidence in this determination. It's not a political decision. I understand the political context that exists. I respect the political context that exists, but the process is based on the law and on evidence, and it has to be.
Okay, Minister, thank you for your time. I appreciate it as always.
Thanks, Vassy.
The Power Panel is here to talk about that. Supriya Dwivedi, Sherelle Evelyn, Tim Powers, and Tracy Ramsey. Tim, I'll start with you. There's a couple ways, as many of our panelists were outlining, to look at this. First of all, the agreement is you pay some money for your own vaccines, and then you pay money for underdeveloped countries to receive vaccines as well. It is also true at the same time that there aren't other G7 countries in this round accessing those vaccines. And there are some advocates for human rights today who are saying, this right now, at this point, at least at this juncture, it could be viewed as accessing vaccines that could otherwise go to developing countries who can't access them through other means, even though I think, as The Guardian put it, we have other side deals.
Well, if you ever had any doubts that Justin Trudeau was shrewd, they should have been alleviated today, because on one hand, he is oft in a place where he's lecturing the world about needing to step up and telling Canadians Canada needs to do more, needs to be very active in a leadership role around the globe. And you would think part of that leadership role is backing up the investments that you made. But he's reading the political winds, and the political winds tell him there's a foul air about, because Canadians aren't seeing the rollout that they thought they would see, and he inflated to a large degree. So if he can get his hands on another million doses of vaccine, he's going to do it. He probably won't suffer the consequences he would if he were doing it at another time, but I do hope hypocrisy will be called out the next time he or anybody in his government starts to lecture about the importance of Canada honoring its commitment to the world.
Sherelle, you hit on this earlier, that, I mean, the government is facing extraordinary, and Tim mentioned too, extraordinary pressure on its own procurement right now. If they had, I can also envision a set of headlines in which they had said, we'll pass on these million doses for a few months at this juncture, that was extremely critical of them for that too.
Yeah, absolutely. There's really no real way to win on this one. I mean, these doses aren't coming next week. They aren't coming even within the next few weeks. If you might have correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they are AstraZeneca doses, which have not yet been approved. In Canada, and we are already getting AstraZeneca doses outside of COVAX, but those aren't coming until after March, if and when they are approved. So it's not something that's going to help right now, and the problem is happening right now, as we're hearing now that there may be a further curtailment of the Moderna vaccine arriving this month. So having all of these, it's great in the whole idea that the Prime Minister and his government is talking about, we have this vast, diverse portfolio of vaccines. We have our fingers in all these different vaccine pies. We're getting as much as we can. It doesn't really help the situation and the heat and the pressure that they're feeling right now when none of those vaccines are arriving on our shores in a timely a manner as they would have liked to have.
Supriya, what do you think about the way in which this is being viewed and the government's response to it?
Look, I mean, to Tim's point about it being hypocritical, it would only be hypocritical if part of the COVAX agreement was never so that the countries paying into it could then get 20% of their vaccine needs met by the COVAX deal. None of this is hypocritical. You can argue about the optics of it, which I agree are suboptimal, especially when you have very many middle and lower income countries who do not right now have the ability to procure vaccines. We've also, have committed with Canada, that is, with respect to donating the surplus of vaccines. And because, it's been alleged that we're like hoarding them and we've signed too many deals for a country of our size. So that would be hypocritical if we then all of a sudden decide to flush those vaccines down the toilet or then not donate them to those lower and middle income countries. I think we are right now in a tough spot. There are global supply chain issues, particularly with respect to the mRNA-based vaccines of both Pfizer and Moderna. And that's not going away anytime soon. I hate to, burst everybody's bubble with respect to, well, why don't we just get this factory to make it? And what about this? But it doesn't work that way. It's to get from DNA synthesis to then, getting mRNA and then mixing that mRNA with lipids, where it's actually from what I understand, where the bottleneck is. There's only like a few hundred people who even know how to do it. And when we're talking about the facilities that are able to do it, there are not that many of them that are out there right now. So it's not easy to do. And the entire world right now is after the world's hottest commodity, which is that vaccine.
Yeah, those vaccines in particular, because the technology is completely new and it's never been tried in Canada. But the other vaccines that have yet to be approved are a different technology that even with the Novavax deal underscores there's potential for an easier potential for the sort of remodeling or rejigging of current facilities at some point. But no, it's not. It's definitely not something that you can just flip a switch and it's going to happen overnight. Tracy, your thoughts on that, and more specifically, I guess, on the COVAX stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is really tough, right? Like, it's clear that we're having difficulties getting vaccines, even from the EU, who won't even include us in an exemption right now, which is quite shocking, I think. We have... Well,
they haven't written it, but they have assured us that we will be exempt.
Okay, so they've assured us, but we're not with the other countries yet. So, I mean, there's a lot going on here, right? And underlining all of this is the Canadians' confidence in the ability for the government to secure the vaccine. So it's not surprising to see them looking in every possible location that they can to find vaccines. I think the concern here is that, the underlying look of this is that, our country, who's able to go and get all these contracts, is now potentially, having vaccines come that would be going to other countries who simply don't have that ability. And these are countries who are, very challenged around healthcare generally, are unable to access the type of healthcare that we have here in Canada. So there are a lot of people in the international community and people who work in that community here in Canada who are concerned about this move. But it's no surprise. The government is looking for some security for Canadians, I think, to have that vaccine, and that will come from a variety of different locations, and this is one that they're willing to go to.
Yeah, I think the point you raised, Supriya, also about surplus doses will be adding to the conversation at some point, because we don't know if those surplus doses are coming at the end of our vaccination program or somewhere throughout it, and at what point they're going to start giving them out, because maybe we'll have a different assessment at that point.
This is not about politics. It's not about infringing upon freedom of belief, association, or freedom of speech. It is about controlling the violent activities of ideologically motivated extremism.
We are calling on the government to go further and to ensure that all white supremacist organizations and extreme right-wing groups which pose the real and urgent threat to Canadian security are dismantled.
Canada has added 13 new groups to its list of terrorist organizations, including the Proud Boys, which was involved in the January 6th siege of the U.S. Capitol. What was the motivation behind it, and what is the significance of the decision? The Power Panel is here with me for one last round. Tim, Tracy, Supriya, and Sherelle. Supriya, I'll start with you, our resident legal expert. From your perspective, how significant is what they did? And I thought it was interesting. My first question to the minister was, would this have happened should there be no January 6th? And he said it still would have.
Yeah, and I mean, I take the minister, I suppose, at his word there, but it's hard to envision a situation in where the opposition, and I'm crediting Mr. Singh for this quite a bit. Jagmeet Singh is really putting and pushing for the addition of Proud Boys and, far-right groups and terror organizations to that list, because it's a counterfactual that I guess you can never really prove, but with respect to, and again, I'm focusing on the Proud Boys in particular here. I mean, Canada has had 3 very terrible exports: Ted Cruz, asbestos, and far-right nationalism. And I think when we're looking at, how Canada has contributed not just to the U.S. and with Proud Boys, but globally with respect to, neo-Nazi ideologies, white nationalism, and other, far-right terror groups, we punch really above our weight here, and that's not a good thing. And so I think a lot of our, inner discourse that we tend to have in this country is like, well, how can we blame America for our latest problems? But we have to really, do a little bit of introspection here and talk about why there are so many Canadians that would even want to be attracted to this sort of ideology to begin with, and why the environment sort of exists for these groups to assemble and organize. And as I said earlier in the Power Panel Express, with respect to the actual implications for this, with Proud Boys having so many, open affiliations with members and the like, that gets into very, real legal and financial consequences for those people. So I would imagine that it would be a very strong deterrent for some to want to then join this group. And I mean, that is ultimately a good thing. I know you're speaking to a couple of experts a little later on about this, and I'm really interested to hear what they have to say about it, because I know there's been some back and forth within the expert community about this as to whether it really does any good or not.
Yeah, for sure. I'm very interested to hear what they have to say too. Sherelle, the political back and forth between Mr. Singh and Minister Blair is interesting too, because Mr. Singh did bring this up, and I just want to make it clear for our viewers, in the House of Commons as a motion, and it got a unanimous support. But at the same time, Minister Blair said, I'm not going to be basing a decision on just the will expressed in the House of Commons. It has to be based on evidence. It has to be based on legalities. It has to hold up in court. And he certainly didn't really love the idea of giving Mr. Singh credit today. Or to be fair, he also didn't want to conflate the two. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it is an important distinction to make, and it's important because it's one of those things that we've seen ever since that motion was passed, is people a little concerned that, politicians on a whim can, denote somebody as a terrorist, which is a frightening prospect when you think about, okay, well, what if there's a government that on the opposite side of the political spectrum from you, and there's a group that maybe you align more with, and you think, okay, well, now can they just decide to designate me a terrorist as well? I don't believe, and to Minister Blair's point, I don't believe that we would have seen this designation come today within these, few days, really, since the House passed that Mr. Singh's motion. Had all that work already not gone into it, had there not been all that gathering of intelligence and evidence to make the determination. But it is interesting that there is that political dynamic. Obviously, the NDP are pushing really vociferously for this, having Mr. Singh be the only, in the House of Commons, be the only person of color to lead a party inside the House. That he was the one to bring this forward, I think, is significant. But I don't think we should be able to conflate the two, that they are political, that is a political victory, as they're calling it, versus one that has been a while in the making.
And bottom line, Tracy, I'm wondering what you think. I mean, my question to the minister when he said, yes, I would have made that determination was, well, then why hasn't it been made earlier? Because it's not like the Proud Boys just came out of thin air. He articulated that there's been an escalation towards violence in the lead up to what happened on January 6th. But certainly, it seems like even as far as Mr. Singh is concerned, there's so much more public awareness of, given what happened on January 6th, that all politicians are, to a degree, reflecting what their constituents are concerned about right now.
Yeah, most definitely. And that's what I said in the opening. This is really about a win for Canadians. There were so many Canadians signing petitions online pushing for this to happen. Certainly, after what happened in January, we saw the Proud Boys, we were all watching it on national TV, watching them marching around the Capitol, knowing that they were homegrown in Canada, disturbed a lot of Canadians. And I think that even potentially Canadians didn't even know that until it came to light when it was being on. So listen, there is more than enough to say that the Proud Boys, even before January and after January, should be labeled and designated as a terrorist organization. This is something that Canadians should be proud of. And I don't, you don't hear any backlash, that's for sure. We're not hearing anyone coming out saying this shouldn't happen. So, there's overwhelming support for this. And even the other groups that were named, there's no place for this racism. And I think it is really significant, for people of color in Black History Month to have this designation happening, I think is meaningful. And, I hope that this move really is a signal to other nationalist groups, white supremacist groups that are mobilizing in Canada to stop because it's going to be taken seriously.
Tim, you get the last word on this.
Well, just picking up on something Tracy said, I'm sure you don't see anybody in our lives, in our mainstream commonalities, common areas speaking out about this, but I worry what's happening in the dark spaces, in the different places where people who harbor hate ideology are gathering, how they're trying to regroup, how they're trying to reform. This is a no-brainer to do. And to one point Sherelle made, which I think is a compliment to past Canadian governments and maybe a criticism as well, as in this being a tool to stamp out free speech if you see somebody who you disagree with. If anything, we're overly judicious and too slow sometimes in getting to the place of acting here. As Supriya pointed out, it's not like the Proud Boys just popped up. It's not like we've just been dealing with right-wing extremism over the last couple of years. It's been out. It's been present. We should have acted faster.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks to our Power panel tonight. Appreciate the discussion. Supriya Dwivedi, Sherelle Evelyn, Tim Powers, and Tracy Ramsey.
There is a great announcement today that the Proud Boys will be banned, will be deemed a terrorist organization. We are calling on the government to go further and to ensure that all white supremacist organizations and extreme right-wing groups which pose the real and urgent threat to Canadian security are dismantled.
Listen, Jake Mason's a politician, so am I. But what I'm trying very hard to do is clearly defend the legal process, which is founded entirely on the law and on evidence in this determination. It's not a political decision.
The Canadian government has officially designated Proud Boys a terrorist entity. The decision follows, but is separate from, a House of Commons vote last week that unanimously called for such a move. Public Safety Minister Bill Blair says it was based on intelligence and evidence, not politics. The Canadian government added a total of 13 groups to its list of terrorist organizations, including 3 with ties to neo-Nazis. Leah West is a former national security lawyer in the Department of Justice, now an assistant professor of national security and intelligence at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. And Jessica Davis is a former strategic analyst with CSIS. She's now the president at Insight Threat Intelligence. Both of them good friends of the show, and they join us here in Ottawa. Hi, good to see you. Thanks for making the time.
Good to see you.
I think, Jessica, I think you're both with us still. Jessica, let me start with you. If you could synthesize for our viewers why the Proud Boys would be on a list of terrorist organizations, what would you say?
I would say that they've engaged in a number of different activities that have crossed over from activism or nonviolent extremism into terrorism. Most notably, and the one that everyone's going to be most familiar with, are the events on Capitol Hill, where they engaged in a variety of different activities, destruction, intimidation, threats, all of which help them meet that definition of terrorism in this country.
Just quickly to follow up with you, the minister said that the designation would have happened even in the event there was no January 6th. What do you take from that?
I find that to be a very interesting statement from the minister, mostly because the public designation that they've released to date doesn't mention specifically any other incidents. So from a public perspective, their designation rests entirely on some vague statements about intimidation, counter-protests, and then very specifically on the events on Capitol Hill. So I find those two statements to be a little bit at odds with each other.
Leah, what does it mean specifically for people who support or express support or throw some money behind the Proud Boys? Like, what does this mean for regular people who are watching, not necessarily who do those kinds of things, but are interested in what happens to people who do?
So essentially, by listing the Proud Boys as a terrorist entity, it's now a criminal offense to facilitate or assist the group in their terrorist activity, or really assist the group in anything that it's doing as a group. So to provide funding to the Proud Boys would be facilitating terrorist activity. To provide any matter of assistance could be facilitating terrorist activity. So for supporters of the Proud Boys in Canada, members who pay dues, any provision of funds to the Proud Boys would now constitute criminal activity and actually a terrorist offense.
And so, quickly to follow up with you on that point, will it be very consequential? And by that I mean, will it work to, in your view, lessen the Proud Boys' presence here, lessen their impact in this country, their ability to have impact? What do you think?
I think it could, and more so than in past designations. You may have heard a lot of criticism about the terrorist entity listing not being very effective, and that's to an extent true. But now we're talking about a terrorist group that does have a footprint in Canada more so than most of the previous entities that have been listed. So we do see supporters, we do see members of this organization in Canada in a way that we may not have seen with other entities. So that could have an impact in a way that, quite frankly, we haven't seen before. There's also the fact that the assets of the Proud Boys now need to be frozen by financial institutions. And obviously, a lack of funds makes it harder to execute terrorist activity.
Jessica, in order to get listed like this, or to qualify or to be labeled a terrorist organization, does the threat to escalation of violence have to occur in this country because the list is, being determined by the federal government here, or can it be based solely on evidence supplied by allies?
It can be based on activities and evidence supplied by allies. So what we've seen in a number of the cases for previous terrorist listings is that activities have taken place outside of Canada, and they still ended up with the groups that perpetrated those acts to be listed in this country. So there's no requirement for that activity to take place in Canada.
Okay. And Leah, I was looking on your Twitter and you had raised some questions about, well, what if Proud Boys have been charged in connection to what happened on Capitol Hill, but not yet convicted. Does that make a difference?
Well, the threshold, the legal threshold the minister kept referring to is when he has to be satisfied on reasonable grounds to believe. That's not the criminal threshold, which is, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So it could be interesting if we see the Proud Boys evade conviction in the United States, where we now have those actions as the basis for a listing here in Canada. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but the fact that we are basing, or at least publicly basing, the listing of the Proud Boys on activity resulting from Capitol Hill attacks on January 6th, where we haven't seen the end result of the criminal result of those attacks, could be interesting. It is unusual in that sense that we're not talking about an attack where an organization has taken and claimed responsibility for a major terrorist attack, and it's very clear that organization was responsible. We're talking about criminal activity that's still in the process of being prosecuted.
Jessica, last question for you. I was thinking this as earlier today, the White House press secretary commented. She was asked about this designation. She said they were reviewing it. To my knowledge, and you would know much better, but there isn't a parallel system in the United States. There's something they can be listed on, but it's not like they have this exact type of list. What might the U.S. be able to do, though, as a result of reviewing what Canada has now done?
So the U.S. can use the information, obviously, that we've made public about the Proud Boys, but for the most part, their processes are going to be independent of our listing process. for the most of the time, we're not going to consider this to be a legal process for the United States' purposes. However, there are impacts on the individuals who may be in the United States or may have close affiliations with the United States from this terrorist listing. Again, certainly traveling across the border could become a lot more difficult, as could conducting any kind of financial transaction for anybody who's ever been affiliated with the Proud Boys, regardless of whether they're in Canada or abroad.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you very much to both of you. I appreciate the discussion and the expertise. Thanks to Leah West and Jessica Davis. That's it for us today. Make sure you subscribe to our pod so you don't miss any of the latest political news. And if you like this episode, share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts